Okay, welcome to my sourdough routine. This is the morning of day 1, and this is my starter that I just took from right out of the fridge, and it's been in there since the last time I made bread. I'm going to get a clean jar and tare my scale. So the first thing I'm going to do is put some water in the jar, and this is just to refresh the starter. I'm going to make enough to make about 4 to 6 loaves of bread with it and have some to put in the fridge for the next time. So I'm going for about 60 grams of water. And then I'm going to add 50% of that weight in sourdough culture, so 30 grams of culture. A lot of people will add 100% of the weight in culture. My starter is pretty active, and this is what I find works best for my time schedule. I mix it up really well to try to incorporate some oxygen into the water because I just think that having that extra bit of oxygen helps the yeast get along nicely. And then I'm going to mix in flour. So I'm going for the same weight in flour as the weight of my water, so 60 grams, but I'm going to split it between rye flour and whole wheat flour. So I'm putting in 30 grams of rye flour right now, then I'm going to do 30 more grams of whole wheat flour. You could use all just whole wheat flour. I really think the rye gives the yeast an extra boost though. Now, I am pretty particular about my weights, usually to the gram, which may seem a little bit excessive, but I think that it's helped me identify over time little things that I could change, especially as the weather changes, or maybe if you're using a different type of flour, you can more easily observe differences in the behavior of your sourdough culture. Also, I forgot to mention the little bit of old starter that was left in the first jar. I'm just going to discard that. I'm not going to save it. There's really not much in there, only maybe a spoonful. So I'm just going to put that in the trash and wash out the jar. And this will be my new starter. It's pretty thick, and that's good. It will be really active over the course of the day. It's going to sit out on the counter, and then we're going to do some more work with it this evening about 12 hours later. So if this is 8 a.m., we will revisit around 8 p.m. Now, I don't usually do this anymore, but just to show you, I'm going to put a little mark on the jar at the level of the starter so that we can see when it's about doubled. It should be about doubled 12 hours later and look very bubbly and healthy. So it's just going to sit out at room temp now. So here it is right after I mixed it, and here it is about 12 hours later. And it looks really good. It looks ready to go. It is evening of day 1, and we're going to mix up a preferment, which is a portion of the dough that's basically just making another sourdough starter, a larger one, to get our dough going. The rest of the dough will be mixed in the morning. This is the master recipe that I always use, that I'm going to give you, and this will make 2 loaves of bread in this bowl. I'm going to start by putting in 30 grams of our ripe sourdough starter. Now, like I said, this is the master recipe I use, and this is what I do all winter. However, it's summer right now, and it's pretty warm in my house, which will make the fermentation go much more quickly. I actually should have decreased the amount of starter that I used and backed it down to maybe 20 grams or something. It would have been fine. Basically, it will be fine. What's going to happen is that it's just going to ferment more quickly than I want. I'm going to run more danger of it being overproved, which we'll talk more about later, but it will still taste fine. It'll be fine. It just would have been better if I had used less. And then I added 240 grams of filtered water, and I'm just going to incorporate the starter in the water. So that was 30 grams of starter and 240 grams of water. Then I'm going to add 210 grams of whole wheat flour. This pre-ferment is going to sit covered on the counter overnight, about another 12 hours, and it will do what our starter did all day. It will expand and it will get bubbly. It might smell a little yeasty or maybe even a tad bit sour in the morning, which is great. And then it will be ready to mix the rest of our ingredients into. I'm going to take the jar of sourdough starter, and now that I'm done mixing the pre-ferment, I can just pop that right back in the fridge, and I'll pull it out the next time I want to make bread and start over again at morning of day one. I'm just kind of scraping the sides of the bowl to get all of the mixture down into the bottom of the bowl. And then I'm going to cover it with some plastic wrap and let it sit. See you in the morning. Good morning. It's day 2, and here's our pre-ferment. You can see right through the bottom of the bowl it's got a lot of bubbles, which is good. It should smell nice and pleasant, and you'll see the texture should definitely be more fluid. The yeast has really been working on it all night. Yeah. Okay, so all we have to do is add to this pre-ferment in the same bowl to make our bread dough. I'm going to start with 480 grams of filtered water. And I realized I probably should be saying milliliters and not grams, but I'm just going to say grams because that's what I read on my scale. And I'm going to be really particular. I went a few grams over and I'm going to pull some out. I'm sorry that you're seeing so much of my countertop. I'm definitely not a professional taking videos. All right, do you think that's good enough? Oh, yep, there we go. Okay, and just mix it up with a spoon. All right, next in the bowl is 750 grams of bread flour. And finally, our last ingredient, do not forget the salt, or it will just, you make bread, so you're not going to forget the salt, but it would be so sad to do. This is Diamond Crystal Kosher salt. Any sea salt or fine grind Himalayan salt or mineral salt would be a good choice. I'm putting in 24 grams of salt. All right, we're just going to mix up the dough. It just, takes a little bit of patience. Mostly we just want to make sure there is no dry flour left in the mixture. Okay, I think we're almost there. You'll notice that once it's mixed, the dough has a fairly shaggy texture. It's not stretching, it's just kind of holding together. We're going to let it autolyze for anywhere between 30 minutes to an hour. I usually set a timer for 45 minutes, and inevitably something happens that I can't get to it right away, and it probably ends up being about an hour. While it's resting, basically all the flour is just really hydrating, and the gluten is starting to strengthen. You'll notice that when you come back after that 45 minutes or an hour, the texture will be quite different. And after that rest, we are going to go through a series of folds over a period of an hour and a half, rather than actually turning the dough out on the counter and kneading it. Okay, so there's our dough. I'm just going to cover it back up with the plastic wrap again and set a timer for about 45 minutes. Okay, the dough has been resting for about an hour. We're going to uncover it and do our first of 4 folds. I'm just going to get a little bit of tap water running here. The dough is sticky, so having your hand a little damp really helps with manipulating the dough and keeping it from sticking to your hands. So all we're going to do is we're basically going to dip our hand down under the dough, and then you just sort of want to stretch it up and over, fold it over the top of itself. Turn the bowl and do the exact same thing, and just work your way around the bowl and do this maybe 10 times or so. Now you can see already that after that hour rest, the dough is a lot more stretchy, and it's just holding together a lot better. It's looking more like good bread dough. After a few folds, I'll be able to actually pick it up and kind of give it a little wiggle and let it hang and let the dough stretch. Now that's good for the development of the gluten, but you don't want to overdo it. You want to be somewhat gentle. You don't want to see the strands actually tearing. And look at that. Doesn't that look good? All right, so that's all there is to the first fold. And we're just going to cover it back up and set a timer for 30 minutes. And in 30 minutes, we'll come back and do fold number 2. Okay, let's do fold number 2. You're going to do the exact same thing you did for your first fold. I just want to point out that it looks a little bit smoother, and every time you fold the dough, it should seem to stretch a little bit better. The surface of the dough should get a little bit more smooth. Now, if you're in the summer and your house is warm like mine is today, you will actually notice that the fermentation is starting to move along even now. So the dough has actually expanded a little bit even from the first fold. And you can feel that it's got more air in it. It's a little bit squishier, even though it is a little bit stretchier. You can just sort of feel that texture, that lightness in your hands. And that's okay. It's just moving along at a fast clip. After we've done our second fold, we'll cover it back up, set another 30-minute timer, and come back for fold number 3. been 30 minutes and we're back for our third fold. You'll notice that the dough has expanded. It's definitely stretchier and it's got more bubbles in it. It feels lighter and squishier to the touch. And like I said before, you want to stretch the dough, but don't stretch it so far that you feel strands of it beginning to break. We want to kind of keep it together. So after this third fold, once again, we're going to set another 30-minute timer and come back and do our last fold. All right, time for the fourth and final fold. And the dough is a lot stretchier than it was at the very beginning. This series of folds and rests has really developed the gluten a lot. Now that the folds are done, it's time for the dough to go through its first proof, otherwise known as bulk fermentation. Okay, I'm going to make sure to cover the bowl with plastic wrap, but first it's a good idea to take a good look at the dough before the first proof and observe the size of it. What we're looking for in this bulk fermentation is for the dough to expand in volume by about 1.5 times its size. Traditional yeast baking, it's often doubling, but with sourdough, we don't want it to get quite that big. So we're looking for about 1.5 times its size by the end of this proof. Okay, so now we are at the end of the first proof, and I am going to call it good because it has gotten the size I want it to get, and I really don't want it to get any larger. It's bubbly. I can see that through the bottom of the bowl. It's definitely got more air in it. In the winter, I almost always do the first proof for 3 hours, and that just always works great. In the summer, you have to be a little bit more observant and watch it, that it doesn't go too far. I think this proof was about 2 hours long. So the next step we're going to go through is dividing this dough into the actual loaves. There you can see the bubbles, and you can tell it's airier because it's got a little bit more of a wiggle to it. Before we turn the dough out onto the counter, I'm going to use all-purpose flour and just dust the countertop with it. The dough is going to be pretty sticky, and it takes a little practice to get the hang of working with it. Flour on the counter is definitely important, but I try not to mix too much flour into it at this point. I just lightly dust my hands whenever I need to. Also, I try to be gentle when I'm turning it out, not overly cautious, but I just want to preserve the air that's been trapped inside the dough and not punch it all out. Because this recipe makes 2 loaves, it's really easy to just divide the dough in half. And then we are going to pre-shape the dough. We'll go through 2 shapings, and this is just the first shaping. Now what I'm doing is I'm trying to create a tight surface on the top of the dough. And the more of a tight surface you get, the better your bread is going to rise in the oven and the better the structure inside is going to be. So all I did was sort of stretch the bottoms of the dough around and over to the top, and then try to flip it over. And then I start rolling the dough on the counter and using the tension between the dough and the countertop to sort of pull the surface of the dough tighter, but not so tight to where the gluten strands begin to tear. So you just want to get some surface tension, but not be ripping the dough. See here, I'm doing it kind of slow so you can see I'm pulling the dough against the counter to tighten the top of the dough. After doing this pre-shape, I'm going to let them rest uncovered on the counter for 10 minutes. And then we'll do the final shaping. After 10 minutes, the dough has relaxed a little bit since the first shaping, and now we'll get an even better shape from it the second time around. But you may notice that sometimes you get some rather large bubbles right under the surface of the dough, and if they're really big, just go ahead and pop them, but don't get sucked into popping all the little bubbles. We want to try to maintain the surface tension as much as we can, so just leave it alone. Today I'm going to make two different styles of loaves so that you can see how they both go. The first is going to go into this proofing basket or banneton, and I've dusted it with rice flour, and these create the beautiful hearth style loaves that you bake on the baking stone and you slice the top and they just turn out looking so lovely. If you don't have a proofing basket, it's very easy to replicate. If you have a colander, just line it with a tea towel and generously dust the tea towel with rice flour, which is the best for releasing the dough, and you'll get the same style of loaf. And then the ones that I bake in the tins, I would call a sandwich loaf, and that's what I make most of the time just because it's so convenient. I can bake several of them in the oven at once, and they're a little bit easier for slicing and eating for the kids, for toast and sandwiches and that kind of thing. I've sprayed this pan with spray coconut oil, which I have personally found to be definitely the best for releasing the bread after it's been baked. We're going to shape both of the loaves exactly the same way. As you'll see in a minute, the only important difference is that the one that goes in the proofing basket has to be flipped upside down since it's going to be turned out again before it goes into the oven. Okay, we are ready to do our final shaping of our loaves. I'm going to do the hearth loaf in the banneton first. So like I said, it's just important to remember that before you pop it in the basket, the seam side needs to go up since it's going to get turned out again. It will actually, I've accidentally put it in seam side down before, and it will totally change the loaf. It won't shape nicely at all. So you just want to make sure that the seam side goes up. I've dusted the tops with flour, and I'm just going to flip the dough over. Make sure I've got enough flour on the counter. Right now, if it sticks to hands and counters a lot, it's just going to be really annoying. So I flipped it over. I'm going to take the edge of the dough farthest away from me and pull it up and just sort of let the dough hang to create some stretch. Then I'm going to fold it over onto itself. And I'm going to take the edge closest to me and do the same thing. Let it hang. And then press it onto itself. Now turn the whole piece of dough 90 degrees. And I'm just going to roll it up towards myself. And I'm going to use my thumbs to sort of push away from me. And that will create stretch on the top of the loaf. And the more tension you get, the tighter you can get the loaf, the better it's going to rise up in the oven. Okay, so I'm going to flip it over and put seam side up into the proofing basket. And then wherever the seam wants to come apart, I'm just going to kind of pinch it back together. And then I will cover this with a piece of plastic wrap to keep any drafts away. Okay, now we're going to shape our sandwich loaf exactly the same way. This time we just won't turn it over before we put it in the pan. Okay, so now the loaves are ready to be covered and go through their secondary fermentation. Now, how long that lasts depends on which option you choose. You can either choose to bake them today on day 2 or tomorrow on day 3. Whenever possible, I opt to bake on day 3. So I'm going to leave them out at room temperature for about an hour, and then I'm just going to transfer them to the fridge overnight to complete their fermentation there. And that will give them a really nice complex flavor. It also gives me a little bit more flexibility with when I can bake them. Okay, now I'm going to pause for a minute to explain that if especially you are going to bake your loaves the same day on day 2, it's especially important to note the size of the dough at this point. Because the same rule as the bulk fermentation applies, you do not want the loaves to rise more than 1.5 times their size before this fermentation is over and you get them in the oven. If they do get that large and you can't bake them right away, you can always just put them in the fridge until you can bake them. All right, it's been about an hour. The dough has puffed up a little bit, and I'm going to bake these tomorrow. So they're going to go into the fridge now to complete the rest of the fermentation process there. It's day 3. It's finally baking day, and for me, this is almost always pretty early in the morning. But this part is so flexible now. You could really bake this whenever it works best for you today. I've just pulled this loaf out of the fridge and it's cold. And while I preheat the oven, I'm going to get it ready to go in. So I'm going to preheat the oven to 475 degrees. Now, you may know that sourdough bread really needs steam during the baking process to form a good crust. And the way we achieve that with a sandwich loaf is very easy, because all you have to do is tent a large piece of aluminum foil over the top of the pan. And what that does is all of the moisture that escapes the dough during the baking process just gets trapped inside with the bread. It's very simple. Just leave room on the top for the dough to expand even more in the oven. Now, I didn't film the baking of this loaf, but I'll tell you what I do. I put the covered loaf right into the 475-degree oven, and then immediately turn the temperature of the oven down to 450 degrees. I set a timer for 20 minutes. And when that timer goes off, I open the oven and remove the foil from the top of the dough. I usually rotate it in the oven, close it up, and let it bake for another about 23 minutes, and then it should be perfectly done. After you remove the pan from the oven, take the bread out of the pan immediately and put it on a cooling rack. And this is one of the hardest parts of making homemade bread, because the cooling process is actually really part of the baking process. And so while we all want to cut into a fresh, warm loaf of bread and eat it, I make myself wait at least 6 to 8 hours before cutting into it. If you cut into it when it's warm, it will be gummy and gooey inside, and that's not really what we want. So I wait and then cut it. If you really want to know how cool it should be, you can take the internal temperature of the bread, and it should be somewhere below 100 degrees before you cut into it. After cutting up the loaf, I simply put it, well, whatever we haven't already devoured, into a gallon Ziploc freezer bag and just put it in the freezer. And it's never really in there that long. We go through the bread, but this does keep it nice and fresh. So now let's move on to baking our hearth loaf. Okay, it's time to bake our next loaf, but first I've just got to pause and explain a couple things about the setup here. So I already have the oven preheated to 475 degrees with a baking stone on the bottom rack. So this time I'm not letting the loaf warm up while the oven is preheating. I'm just taking it straight out of the fridge because it's easier to work with that way. Okay? All right, let's move on. Okay, so my goal here is to get this dough out of the proofing basket and into the oven as gently as possible so I don't knock the air out of it. I am putting a piece of parchment paper on a cookie sheet that's flat, that doesn't have any walls. It's going to be like my peel. And I'm just carefully turning it over and lifting the basket off. Okay, and now I need to score the top of the dough, and this will help it to open up really nicely and give it a nice, beautiful shape. I'm using a lamb which is basically a very sharp, double-sided, curved razor blade. And as I did this, I said to Dan, I don't think I cut that deep enough, but I was nervous because I was videoing and I didn't want to go back and mangle it more. So it is what it is, and you're just going to see what happens if you don't slash it quite deep enough. You need to be confident. All right, so I'm going to slide this right onto my stone, but first let's pause again. So remember how sourdough bread needs steam in the oven so that it can expand and open up properly and get a beautiful crust. Well, a lot of times recipes will have you put a broiler pan in the bottom of the oven full of water, but I have found that this is a hassle and doesn't work that well because residential ovens are designed to ventilate out. They just get the steam out constantly, whereas a bakery oven is actually designed to inject steam and keep it in there with the dough. But there is a very clever trick to doing this without a Dutch oven and without doing the pan of water, and it's simply to have an oven-safe mixing bowl, a metal bowl that's large enough to go over your loaf. So you just slide the loaf onto the baking stone, and then we're going to put an upside down bowl on top of it to trap the steam in with the dough like we did with our sandwich loaf. Okay, let's see it work here. And that's that. I'm going to turn the temperature down to 450 like we did with the other loaf and set the timer for 20 minutes. And it's been 20 minutes now, and all I'm going to do is take off the bowl and do the second half of the bake. And I'm just going to bake it for another 23 minutes. All right, it's time to take the bread out. I'm putting on my oven mitts and I'm just going to pull it straight out and onto a cooling rack. Okay, let's take a look at the loaf. Now, right off the bat, some people would probably say it's burned, but I disagree. I prefer a darker bake like this. I think it lends a much more complex and delicious flavor when parts of the crust are almost approaching being too dark. I would much rather have that than a loaf that looks a little pale. So I bake mine a little bit longer, but that is personal preference. And as you can tell from where the loaf actually opened up, it's not burned inside, and I guarantee that it's not even going to be approaching dryness. It's going to be great. The other thing I want to look at is where the loaf opened up, where I slashed it. And remember, I didn't quite slash it deep enough. You should probably be aiming for about 1/4 inch of depth, and I probably slashed it about 1/8 of an inch. It did open up on that end of the loaf, but you'll notice here on the back, it didn't really open up at all. So that's what happens. It's okay. It might be slightly more dense inside because of that, but overall, it's okay. It's going to be fine. So now we're just going to patiently let it cool all the way, and then we'll cut it open and look at the inside. Now, analyzing your loaf of bread can be pretty tricky because there are a lot of different things to look at, and it's hard to sort out what could have been better. With sourdough, it's better to underprove slightly than to really overprove it. Well, with any bread. A fully overproofed loaf is going to rise up really big and then actually deflate and turn into sort of a rubbery pancake that's not even fit to eat. However, that's actually pretty hard to achieve with sourdough. You'd really have to let it go. If it's underproofed, what you're going to notice is really big bubbles, probably surrounded by very dense areas, and you don't really want that. So in this loaf, you can see the bubbles are pretty evenly distributed. Some of them are a little bit bigger, some of them are smaller, but it's not really dense in any areas. It's okay. I would like some of the bubbles to maybe be a little bit bigger, but that's all right. It's not too bad. Now remember, we may have overproofed it just slightly because it's warm and because I used more starter to begin with. But being slightly overproofed is really not a big problem. Now that I've cut all the way through the loaf, I want to show you just some evidence that I did ferment it just a little bit too long, but overall it looks pretty good and it's going to be delicious. But here is something you can see. There are some bubbles that are forming right under the crust line. Now this is really minor, but if it had gone a little bit longer, what we would get is what's called a flying crust, which is in the bake when the crust actually sort of springs up and separates from the rest of the loaf, and you get a big bubble or a tunnel sort of that lies right under the crust. And you can see the beginnings of it forming here. At least for my recipe, that usually happens when it's been a little bit overproofed. So we're right on the cusp of it being a little bit too long, but nobody's gonna care about these bubbles. It's gonna get eaten, and I'm okay with it. I would probably give this loaf a solid B. It's not perfect, but I still love it. Thank you for sticking with me this long. I know it's been a very long video with a lot of information and you don't even get to taste the bread at the end. But my hope for you is that very soon you will have some delicious sourdough in your own kitchen for you to enjoy. Bye.